after we do. Excellent. Okay. Hi, folks. Thanks for joining us this evening. If you are here for our event with Allegra Hyde and Vanessa Hua celebrating Allegra's book, Eleutheria, you are in the right place. I'm Car. I'm the events coordinator for Green Apple Books here in San Francisco. There it is. It's a beautiful book. Both aesthetically and content-wise, it is a beautiful book. And I'm very pleased to not only have both of these authors joining us. I've been waiting a long time for this event, but I'm also happy to share that Eleutheria is our March selection for our Apple a Month subscription service. And if you want to know more about our subscription service and figure out how you can pick up a book such as Eleutheria for yourself, I'll gladly link it in our chat here. A couple of items of business before we get started. You can check out our full event calendar online at greenapplebooks.com. I'm a little biased, but we do have a pretty great calendar lined up for the coming season. And I would be remiss if I did not say, please do buy books. Please do buy books if you can. Please do buy them from us if you can, or an independent bookstore of your choice. But you're here with us tonight, so why not? When you buy books from Green Apple, you help us put on events such as these. You support these authors that put so much work into making these books, and then you get to have a book, and that might be the best part. So if you can, please do buy books. This evening, we'll have a Q&A at the end. So anytime you have a question throughout the hour, you can go ahead and enter that into the Q&A box. It'll either be at the bottom of your screen or on the side of your screen, depending on your interface. Anytime something comes up, feel free to enter it, and we will get to as many questions as we can by the end of the hour. So without further ado, I'd like to go ahead and introduce the two authors joining us this evening. First, Vanessa Hua is a columnist for the San Francisco Chronicle and the author of the novel A River of Stars and the story collection Deceit and Other Possibilities. She's a National Endowment for the Arts and Literature Fellow. She's also received the Asian Pacific American Award for Literature and a Steinbeck Fellowship in Creative Writing, as well as awards from the Society of Professional Journalists, among many other accolades. She's filed stories from China, Burma, South Korea, and elsewhere, and her work has appeared in publications such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Atlantic. She has taught most recently at the Warren Wilson MFA program for writers at the Sewanee Writers Conference, and her latest novel, Forbidden City, is out next month. I will link that in our chat for the pre-order page. Please do welcome Vanessa Hua. Hi, Vanessa. And last but most certainly not least, Allegra Hyde's debut story collection Of This World won the John Simmons Short Fiction Award through the Iowa Short Fiction Award Series. Her stories and essays have appeared in the Pushcart Prize, Best of the Net, the Best Small Fictions, and the Best American Travel Writing. Originally from New Hampshire, she currently lives in Ohio and teaches at Oberlin College. Her novel, Eleutheria, is the reason we are here today, so please join me in welcoming Allegra Hyde.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Car, for that wonderful introduction. And thanks to all of you in the audience coming here tonight to celebrate this wonderful book, Eleutheria. So Allegra, I think you wanted to treat us to a reading to begin.
Yeah, and I also just wanted to say thank you to Green Apple Books for hosting this reading. Thank you to everyone for coming. And I wanted to say thank you to Vanessa for being my co-conspirator this evening. And I thought it might be also fun just to share a little bit of context of how we know each other, because we first met in person in 2017 at Breadloaf, which was a writing conference I found pretty intimidating. But Vanessa is the kind of person who makes you feel like you always belong, and is one of the kindest people I know. So, and is also one of the most brilliant writers I know. So it's really exciting to being in conversation with you. My plan is to read just a couple minutes from partway through chapter 1, which I know. I guess I'll just to kind of get you up to speed, since it's partway through chapter 1. This is we will be with my protagonist, Willa Marks, who is the book's narrator, and she has just arrived in the on the island of Eleutheria with the intention of joining this eco compound called Camp Hope. And she hasn't been invited, but she's going there because she's certain that this very secretive compound holds the key to addressing the climate crisis. She wants to be a part of that process, and she thinks that this truly will solve climate change and maybe also address some of her personal wounds. So we're basically going to jump in right when she has arrived in front of Camp Hope. The doors to Camp Hope opened with ease, well-greased, silent. I had to shield my eyes as I stepped inside. The compound's low, breezy bungalows and pavilions and laboratories, all painted in a wash so white the buildings gleamed with snow-blinding brightness. But this was Eleutheria, an island blessed by equatorial warmth. Between the buildings were garden plots flush with melon leaves, feathery carrot tops, rows of purple beans. An orchard offered trees loaded with avocados and sugar apples. Hibiscus blossomed everywhere, at once jewel-like and giant. This was Camp Hope. The text of Living the Solution rippled into reality. Solar arrays glinted from rooftops. Carbon capture units hummed near the shore. A wind turbine twirled overhead. All of Camp Hope spread out as immaculate and peopleless as a museum diorama. I giggled, astonished and perplexed, and as my voice exited my mouth, it diffused into the landscape. "Hello?" I called, but that sound also dissipated. Sunlight dappled a pathway of crushed shells. I meandered along it, ducking under trellised passion fruit vines, through open-air hydroponics labs, into sleeping quarters filled with bunks made bandage tight. From an observation deck, I watched an egret slide over a curving stretch of sand, settle on a gnarled clump of mangroves. At the center of the grounds, a geodesic dome humped from the earth, its glassy surface composed of honeycomb panels. One of the panels flickered. I rushed forward, bracing for my first encounter with a Camp Hope crew member, but met only the reflected slouch of my overalls, my knot of hair, my own wide eyes. Behind the glass, rows of tables sat empty. I licked salt from my upper lip, the sun squeezing sweat from my pores. Everything was right, and yet nothing was right. On a rigid laundry line, dish towels fluttered in the breeze as if trying to tug themselves free. I let one flutter against my face. I turned and slow circles wandered onward. Time elongated, minutes expanding, doubling back. I became unsure of which pathways I'd taken. The hibiscus blossoms I'd already passed. Though the Camp Hope compound was contained on a stubby peninsula, covering a square mile at most, it seemed city-sized, sprawling. I leaned against a raised garden bed to catch my breath. My elbow upset a watering can perched on the ledge, sending the container crashing onto the gravel below. Water glugged out and disappeared. My throat tightened. I called another hello into the grounds, still serene, fragrant with flowers and ripening fruit. The wind turbine pinwheeled overhead. The ocean sparkled in the distance. That Camp Hope's crew members could have given up, abandoned everything, seemed impossible. That Roy Adams could have, even more so. I entertained the idea of foul play. They were corporations, governments with something to lose if Camp Hope succeeded. Yet the grounds showed no sign of a struggle. I wondered if the crew members were hiding. I wondered if they were invisible. Camp Hope's advanced eco-technology having spurred unprecedented genetic mutations. I wondered if they'd all been sucked into the sky by a green god who welcomed them into a chlorophylled paradise. The sun pressed down like a hot thumb, crushing these ideas. I slumped into the leafy shade of an elephant ear and unpeeled my backpack straps. Sweat swept my forehead, stung my eyes. I had forgotten to pack a water bottle. In my rush to leave for Eleutheria, I had forgotten to pack a lot of things. And I will pause there. Thank you.
Thank you for that amazing excerpt you read. I think it kind of captures the sense of doom that is present throughout the novel, but yet also the sense of hope. Willa is really hoping to find a solution to so many things in her life and for the sort of fate of the planet in Camp Hope. And I was hoping you could kind of give us a thought on, tell us about Willa, how she was raised, to kind of look, what is the hole in her life that she's looking to fill? And I think she has an interest in conspiracies. Like, how did her upbringing sort of kind of start her along this path?
Yeah, I think a lot of the writing process of this book was in some ways coming to understand Willa and coming to understand why she makes the decision in the first place to go to Camp Hope, to leave her whole life behind and make this pretty extreme decision to join a pretty extreme group. And that decision is very much informed by where she came from and who she is. And to give some of that backstory, she was raised by parents who were so overwhelmed by the crises of our world that they turned to doomsday prepping and basically kind of retreating from society as a way to cope with that reality. So she was raised in a very isolated manner, and ultimately her parents don't make it, and she goes to live in Boston with her cousins, which is a huge culture shock. And her cousins have yet another way of kind of coping with reality, which is to live through a kind of false reality of posting online and kind of creating a false existence on the internet that they can live vicariously through, and that's their coping mechanism. And Willa engages with that a little bit, and the more time she spends in Boston, the more she encounters essentially different ways of coping with these of the challenges of our modern age. And I think she's someone who keeps looking for an answer. She's kind of come to the realization that she doesn't ascribe to her parents' way of thinking, and she's trying to figure out an alternative, and that alternative becomes this sort of 180 away from despair towards a really extreme optimism and extreme hope. And the book pushes that to as far as it can go.
And so, and also I think I would love to hear about your interest in utopias. And I think you spent some time in eco-utopian communities and also among freegans. So I'd love to hear all about that.
Yeah, I mean, I've always been interested in intentional communities, whether it's the Shakers or Back to the Land hippies. I'm impressed by the courage that it takes to step away from mainstream society, to live differently, to try to problem solve in a kind of closed environment. Sorry, my computer just started downloading something.
Okay. It's the government tracking us.
So that's always been really fascinating to me. And I think I've sought that out through research, but I've also sought that out in my own life. I did spend a while with freegans, dumpster diving, participating in what they called a really really free market, where they're giving away things that had been dumpster dive, cooking collective meals with food that had been dumpster dived, and that was really eye-opening to me. I really love hearing kind of just different ways of approaching reality, and Freegans definitely did that. I also spent a lot of time in New Zealand, traveling around hippie communes there. There are more intentional communities per capita in New Zealand than anywhere else. And so that was a way to be immersed in communes that were trying to do things differently, and in some ways were really great. And in some ways were really hard to exist within. You know, there was a point when I couldn't eat any more lentils. And I think in an intentional community, you're always trying to wrestle with the fulfilling an ideal, and then pushing up against just practical realities and also human fallibility. And so my research and my personal experience definitely infuses this book.
So when you were in these communities or dumpster diving, were you thinking of it as research, or were you thinking of yourself as being in community with them? Were you in writer mode, or did you have a double consciousness? Or
well, when I was with the Freegans, I was actually making a documentary.
oh, okay.
So but it was, I think, when you're making a documentary, in order to effectively kind of capture the truth of a situation, you also have to kind of become part of the group. Mm-hmm. And so it was maybe a kind of double consciousness of forming relationships, creating trust, but then at the same time, stepping out of that group at times to observe and to ultimately be able to create a narrative out of what you're witnessing. And when it came to spending time in New Zealand, for instance, I went there with the intention of truly becoming a hippie. However, I did not succeed, failed pretty miserably. I couldn't break my habit of, for instance, wanting to go for a jog sometimes and exercising, and that just didn't align. So I think my sort of innate personality is someone who does observe situations and who has that kind of writerly disposition was present. And as much as I was trying to become a hippie, I was also taking notes in my notebook, just observing what was happening. And so in that way, it was definitely a double consciousness.
And I have some more questions about utopias, but I was wondering, they didn't allow jogging because you're supposed to, any exertion was supposed to be for farming, or what was the ban against jogging?
I mean, there was no official ban, but I think, say we spent the morning, for instance, I don't know, weeding radishes. And then in the afternoon, it was kind of leisure time, and some people might kind of hang out by the river smoking, and I got restless and I wanted to go jog. So I think I think it was just my kind of just being someone who likes to be busy, and right. I wasn't able to just chill out the way.
Or the streak of independence represented by the running.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
But I read the interview you did with Matt Bell, and you made an interesting comment, just that as fallible as people are and as these utopias are, that some of their ideas are in a way ahead of their time, that in some ways some form of it percolates to the mainstream. And I was hoping you could talk about that.
Yeah, I think sometimes utopian communities get a bad reputation for being doomed to fail. And I have read a statistic that most of them don't last more than 2 years. And I think I've always felt some resistance to the label of failure being ascribed to an enterprise like an intentional community solely on kind of temporal grounds. Because I think just putting an idea out there and expressing it and kind of making it real, making it possible, even for an ephemeral moment, can mean something. And so in that interview with Matt Bell, I think I bring up the fact that Brook Farm was really interested in gender equality, and for its time, a really kind of progressive, they had a really progressive vision for what that would be. And that community did not last, but I think it meant something for it to have existed at all and to have manifested that. And I was actually thinking about that in relation to climate activism today as I was reading the recent New Yorker article about the Sunrise Movement and the fact that the idea of a Green New Deal, which I think is pretty widely known now and is in some ways almost mainstream as just a possibility, was pretty recently just it didn't carry any weight. No one knew what that was. No one could visualize it at all, and it kind of needed to be it just needed to be expressed. Someone had to imagine it in order for it to gain traction and to become a possibility. So I feel the same way about a utopian community. Maybe it doesn't, I don't know if maybe these things aren't comparable, but I think the common denominator here is a willingness to imagine into uncharted territory and to imagine better possibilities despite the odds and despite the fact that maybe they seem doomed to fail in that moment.
Yeah, and I definitely want to return to the idea of sort of what sort of movement, without giving too much away, like what's to come in sort of the wake of Camp Hope. But we can return to that sort of later in our conversation. But I did also want to touch upon this island. This has been a place. There's two timelines in the book. There's Willa's story and Camp Hope, but also hundreds of years ago and sort of like the first Western settlers and sort of what they found. And I was really interested in hearing why the two timelines. Was it this idea of paradise continually being found and remade, or and just what having those two timelines meant for you?
Yeah, it always felt really important for me as an author to have that thread of history running through this kind of present or near future vision of Willa's life and of the world. And my goal was to show how people and places are connected across time. So that was one goal. And I also wanted to put my speculative environmental compound within the larger context of the colonial history of the Bahamas and the patterns of idealism and exploitation that have played out there over and over again. One of the things that really interested me about the region was the fact that it felt like it embodied so many chapters in the history of the Americas in a really kind of concentrated way. We see Puritans arriving, we see pirates playing out there, we see the kind of tourism industry shape the place, we see the military show up there, and over again, the island has a vision of paradise projected onto it that is ultimately twisted into an exploitative moment. And it felt important to ultimately, by the end of the book, put that in relation to Camp Hope so that we can recognize how, despite all the positive things that Camp Hope could potentially do, it is also perpetuating these kind of ongoing patterns, and that in order for climate change to be actually effectively addressed, it has to go hand in hand with a reckoning with the past. It can't kind of be in denial of that history.
Yeah, I think what really impressed me was this recognition of patterns, of these sort of larger structures of power or oppression that dictate, the world of this book and the world that we're in. And just sort of along those lines, like when you were depicting the dystopia of this near future, what was your thinking that went into it? There's a quote from that you may know from Octavia Butler, where she says, let's see, I didn't make up the problems. All I did was look at the problems we're neglecting now and give them about 30 years to grow into full-fledged disasters. And she was talking about Parable of the Sower, those books. But just for you, how did you sort of like map out everything that was going to be wrong in this world?
Yeah, I think I definitely ascribe to Octavia Butler's method. She is the ultimate queen of this writing, and I'm forever impressed by the fact that in Parable of the Sower, Parable of the Talent, she predicts a president with the slogan "Make America Great Again." It's unreal. So I think it's absolutely true that looking at the facts of the present, you can extrapolate forward into the future and guess it. How will things unfold? And so I did a lot of research on kind of predictions for climate, for sociological adjustment, and tried to exaggerate, distort, push that forward, and also in some ways just state specifically things that are happening now that might just not be noticed, or might be not as conspicuous because they're not getting reported, or they seem almost too extreme to be real. One of those things would be the number of mass mortality events that actually occur almost every day around the world of just animal species. And that could be a pod of dolphins beaching mysteriously. It could be antelopes just suddenly keeling over on the savannah. And I think there are websites where people are trying to document these occurrences, and it's really extreme and it's really horrific. And it's the kind of thing that is, one might think that's a future that's 50 years away, but it's happening now. And that's something that a detail I put in the book was just some mass mortality events among animals, because it's part of our lived experience.
Yeah, I think it's the time when reality defies fiction. When by simply just including it, you're putting a spotlight on something that is actually happening. Or it reminds me of Margaret Atwood's *Handmaid's Tale*, where she had said that reality, that world, everything that happened in that world had happened somewhere already in history. So, but I think you bring up there's a part of the novel that involves the wealthy, the children of the sort of wealthy and powerful to sort of be sort of, I don't want to give anything away, but they're an integral part of sort of what happens with the camp and what actually goes horribly wrong. But what have you spent time with younger people, or just, it's interesting in sort of thinking about Gen Z, or they've been raised on climate change in a way, or my twin sons, they're 10 years old, every half their life, they're going to remember summer as the time of wildfires or the time of drought. And so just in terms of the characters in your book, or just sort of larger thoughts overall about what does it mean in terms of climate with this upcoming generation?
Yeah, when it comes to the recruits in the book, I think they are an expression of wealth inequality, basically, and of privilege being passed on and protected in a way that is grossly unfair. And so that's kind of one of their functions within the book. Have I spent time with young people? Absolutely. I'm around them all the time as a college professor, teaching undergrads. And I think the younger the students are, or I guess the more I teach and as students kind of cycle through, more they increasingly have experienced more disaster.
Yeah.
And I think our their future becomes more and more imperiled as well. And so, of course, they have an even more intense relationship to the decisions that are being made now. And I think about, I am really inspired by the work that they have done. And I tried to, in some ways, capture just the tenacity, the creativity, the urgency that the youth activists are kind of bringing to conversations about climate change right now in the novel, and in my own way. Leaders like Greta Thunberg are really inspiring, and I think should be listened to. I think that youth have as much of a right, if not more of a right, to be actively participating in the policy decisions that will define how we're able to live in, coming decades and centuries, hopefully.
Right. Or we don't wind up on another planet.
Yeah.
Just a reminder, if anyone has questions, please put them in the Q&A. We'd love to hear if you have questions for Allegra and this wonderful novel, but we'll also continue chatting. So this is also a love story. So
yeah.
Did you talk about Willa's sort of coming into her own, and Sylvia, and just, again, I feel like this is a novel of sort of like individual and global crises that we're examining. But if you could talk about the importance of at the heart of it, this love story.
Yeah, I always knew going to this novel, I wanted to engage with climate change. I wanted to really get into the meatiness of the facts of these current crises, but I also always wanted to make sure that it was a human story as well, so that in some ways the statistics that are always being thrown around about climate change just felt more real and valid and approachable. And so in some ways the love story is just a way to bring the story back to in a familiar experience, and to create a connection between the personal and the political. I think for Willa specifically, Sylvia is another person she meets in her life who seems like they might have the answer for how to be in the world, and how to deal and how to cope with the challenges of the current world. And so that's and Sylvia, I should also say, as a Harvard professor, is in some ways kind of cynical about the possibility of really affecting change, or affecting change radically. So she's very different from Willa. And in some ways, I always kind of imagined their two ideologies, or their two demeanors and ways of being, as forming a kind of double helix that held up the core of the book in a way. And so they're the kind of push-pull of their relationship, the way they both want different things from each other, are drawn to one another, sometimes in a loving way, sometimes in a kind of problematic way. It's a narrative engine. It allows the novel to engage with different ideas about, what do we do in this world, and how do we do it? And if you do have a platform or a voice or some kind of professional acumen, like someone like Sylvia, are you kind of obligated to use that to the best of your ability to deal with climate change? Or do you have a right to just kind of protect yourself as best you can within the cocoon of an institution like Harvard? And so that was important for the book. I don't.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think also Sylvia, in some ways, represents the sort of complicitness of those in power and with privilege. Like, sure, they can speak up, but they're benefiting from the system of power. So they're not incented, let's say, to burn it all down.
Yeah, and I just to kind of go back to the question about why I had that history thread throughout the novel. One of the reasons why Sylvia works at Harvard is that Harvard benefited when it was a kind of initially founded from resources from the Bahamas, and its endowment was kind of initially created by the sale of Brasiletta wood from the region, and that was the kind of connection that I wanted to draw through time and kind of really show. And so by having her work there, that was a way to tie those threads together.
Definitely. So we have some great questions in the Q&A. Ariel asks, what aspect of the book was the most fun and enjoyable for you to write?
What was the most fun? I mean, I did love writing about the Freegans and writing about the joy of discovery, the joy of a search through a dumpster, through sidewalk trash piles for stuff. And to me personally, and for my protagonist, coming across something that is useful, whether it's food or a shirt, and being able to take that home and use it, that feels magical. And so I really enjoyed writing that, and I hope that it's also fun to read.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, and I think there is something amazing about taking what others view as trash and turning it into treasure, or being able to see the treasure for what it actually is. And I think, during the pandemic, I really got into foraging. So
yeah.
I don't know. It's not quite, it's Freegans forage in an urban setting, I suppose.
Yeah.
But the same idea, like you come across a weed, what others view it as a weed or something to kill off or to destroy or to pluck, but actually it's delicious. So,
yeah.
And then Rachel Krantz asks, congratulations on a truly fantastic novel. I'm curious, did you write the first draft in a mostly linear way, or did you write alternating timelines separately and weave them together? I guess with the two timelines. She says, basically, I want to hear as much as possible about your writing process.
Yeah. Thank you, Rachel. The process was messy and horrific, and maybe shouldn't be replicated. But originally this novel was a short story called Shark Fishing that was in my first collection, and
which you should also get if you want some more on YouTube.
Yeah, there's a geodesic dome on the cover, so it's what's not to love. So even though that story was the longest story in the collection, I just couldn't let it go, and I knew that there was more that I wanted to unpack and explore. So I ended up embarking on a novel, and that meant kind of breaking the story open, reinventing it. And I didn't write it in a linear way. I wrote what I would call islands, just basically sections of it, pieces, scenes, character sketches, and just tried to generate as many words as possible and get to know the situation better. And then from there, trying to stitch things together, trying to understand where the story was going. And it was very much just kind of feeling around in the dark. At various times, I tried to create an outline, and inevitably I would cast the outline aside and start anew. And it took years and years, and also involved just me trying to learn how to be a better writer so that I could live up to what I wanted my novel to be. I read a lot about screenplays at one point because I was trying to figure out how to get better at plot. And so that was part of the process. And then finally, I was able to figure out the structure. And from there, again, engaged in the very painful editing process of, making one change somewhere that creates the butterfly effect that changes everything else. So it was really challenging, and it felt so different from writing short stories, which I usually did. I have generally just written in one go, where I get a full sense of what the story is going to be, even if it gets revised a lot. I can see most of it. So it was it was a crazy process. Would not repeat, but I'm hopeful that my next novel won't be quite as chaotic, but you never know.
I do feel that every time you start a new novel, you're learning how to write that novel. So even though you may know logically, like, oh, I wrote a novel, I wrote a whole book, it's still a process of relearning it. So did you print it all out? Did you sort of move things around? Like, how did you sort of hold everything together as you were revising it?
Oh yeah, unfortunately I printed things all the time, which used, acres of forest to print out. And at one point I created this like serial killer map, or maybe detective.
You were drawing
map,
on a glass with a pen.
Well, I did have like a big wall chart at one point, but I also put up lots of pictures on the wall of people from magazines that I thought looked like my characters, and like pictures of places and connecting them. So that was quite something, but that helped me hold everything in my mind. I also am someone who handwrites a lot, and that so kind of going back and forth between printing things out, handwriting again, typing it up, was slow going. Again, would not recommend.
But I think that's just the way you had to write this book, right?
Definitely, yeah.
There was no like sort of like secret,
there's no shortcut.
like a secret way through. So Molly asks, Allegra, islands keep coming up in the discussion. The book setting, living in isolated communities, living on the island of New Zealand. How did the concept or symbolism of islands involved in the development of the story?
Yeah, thank you, Molly, and also hi. Molly and I worked together on an island, so I'm guessing that that was part of this question. We worked on an island called Star Island off the coast of New Hampshire, which in a way feels like a kind of utopian community, an intentional community. There's just one old hotel out there, and the workers on the island, who are called pelicans, form a kind of subculture over the summer that to me is very utopic. So I think I just have a love of islands in part, and that infuses my work. But yeah, I think islands are interesting in the way that they concentrate culture, they concentrate environmental evolution in a way. They, by being separated from a mainland, just kind of metaphorically, they represent some distance from the mainstream, we could say, and a chance to maybe take a breath, to have that perspective, literally and figuratively, looking back at what everyday life is. And I think within the novel, Willa as a character is someone who's drawn to isolated, concentrated spaces. She grows up making terrariums, and that's one of the ways she's able to make growing up with doomsday prepping parents work, because that's kind of her outlet. And terrariums are these enclosed, isolated spaces. They're kind of islands in and of themselves, and they're able to be kind of perfect and kind of self-governing. And I think when Willa eventually makes it to Camp Hope, she thinks of Camp Hope as a kind of life-size terrarium, something that has the potential to be perfect. However, unlike a terrarium, Camp Hope it can't kind of be sealed forever. It can't be cut off forever. It is part of a larger context. Even on an island, it's connected to other people and places and things. So it isn't able to live up to everything she hopes it does.
Well, actually, I remember you shared a craft talk you did for Warren Wilson about novelists or writers are like makers of terrariums. And so in what ways is your novel like was like putting together a terrarium or not? Or did it feel like in some ways it took on a life of its own that you couldn't necessarily control or predict?
Yeah, I'm one of the ways I think about novel writing as well as story writing is, can this piece of literature, if we can call it that, stand on its yeah, capital L literature, stand on its own, and can it just as a terrarium kind of cycles through its own miniature weather system, and every element kind of impacts every other element. If a plant dies, it's going to kind of be reabsorbed by the moss that is in there, and it's always in motion. It's always kind of contained. I do kind of bring that sensibility to my writing, and the hope is that, you know, a story, a novel can stand on its own, that it will always be in motion, that every element's going to inform every other element, and these ecological principles will hold true in a literary way.
Right, definitely. And so do you have any, are you working on short stories now, or another novel, or?
Yeah, I have a second story collection that is in the pipeline. If all goes well, it might actually come out next year. Oh. It's called The Last Catastrophe. All the stories are speculative in nature, and I kind of think of them as the children of this novel, because there are a lot of ideas or concepts that I couldn't quite fit into this already packed book. And so short stories were a way to explore some other concepts, and sometimes to explore them in wilder ways than would work within the universe of the novel. For instance, there are vegan zombies in one of the stories in the forthcoming collection.
That's super exciting to hear. Congratulations. Do you think, so are you still finishing out the stories for that collection, or like, what do you, when you have time to work on your fiction, what are you sort of engaged with right now?
Well, the stories are all done, so I'm just in the editing process now. And in some ways, I'm kind of looking ahead to my next project and kind of beyond that story collection. And I think I still want to be engaging with climate change in some ways, but I'm thinking about going more magical realist potentially. I don't want to say too much, but that's definitely just of importance to me. And you know, I'm someone who believes that every person has some sphere of influence when it comes to addressing a crisis like climate change. We all have different skills and abilities, and I know I'm able to write, so that's kind of a sphere that I can work in. And for someone else, they might have a different set of skills, and maybe they bring that to the table. But for me, this isn't something I'm going to set aside and be done with.
Right. These are, it's a thing that I think it's interesting when you look at a writer's work over a body of time, like either by theme or by character. Like we're concerned with the same preoccupations. We're not writing the same stories, but it's the same concerns.
Totally.
So what does it mean to, what does it mean for, so someone just asked, what's the best thing you ever found while dumpster diving?
I got some pretty good bakery goods, I would say, that maybe they just didn't sell that day. But I remember one really good black and white cookie that I took home. So that was a highlight.
Donuts also play a role in the novel. And even though it was just a side job for her, I started craving donuts, I have to say.
Yeah, the whole story. Donut hole shop.
So I've had the pleasure of, I think, seeing you read twice, once at Red Loaf and once at Sewanee last summer. And I think you bring a lot of flair to it, not only in sort of like how you're outfitted, but in sort of like the way you memorize. And just, do you have like a path, like a what do you have like a past in performing, or how does that, or do you have something, maybe you could talk about that and how maybe that's a part of who you are as a writer as well.
Well, I can't believe I'm going to confess this, Vanessa, but when I was young, I did go to mime camp.
Oh,
So I guess you could say that I have some theater, performative background. I think to me, performing work is connected, or is just another way to connect with readers. And I think about how stories in the olden days would have just been told person to person, would have been told orally, would have been told around a campfire. And I like the idea of bringing some of that kind of campfire energy to a reading, and to try to return to that sense of storytelling as just a way to better understand each other, the world, the moment, as a way to kind of explain to ourselves, like, what was that weird creature we saw out in the woods, and like, what are these stars doing? And maybe it's kind of been extrapolated in a way into this literary form, but at its core, I'm still thinking about maybe that primal storytelling impulse.
Yeah, if those of you tuning in, if you ever have a chance to see Allegra live, it really does feel like you're by a campfire with the gestures.
There's a lot of hand motion.
Yes. Well, no, and also the flair, the interplanetary.
Yeah,
that
the shawl. Yeah, it doesn't really work on Zoom, but I do like to wear clothing that kind of plays a role as well. So I think thanks for giving me that shout out.
Yes, definitely. So does anyone have any final questions? Otherwise, I might move on to the speed round.
Oh my God.
Don't be terrified. It'll be fun. So, okay. So there are no right or wrong answers. Just so coffee or tea?
Coffee.
Island?
No, tea too. Tea. I like them both.
Islands or peninsulas?
Islands.
Okay. Moose or snowshoe hares?
I'm gonna go with moose.
Okay. Ice storm or snowstorm?
Oh, snowstorm.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Allegra, for answering my questions and the audience questions, and congratulations on really an amazing book. Yeah, I hope you're celebrating this week.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. And everyone should also pre-order Vanessa's forthcoming novel, Forbidden City. I have read it, and it's really amazing. And it's a whole other way of thinking about idealism. So highly recommended.
Thanks.
Thank you both so much. And thank you all for joining us. Allegra, I am so impressed that you went to mime camp. That really made my day on top of everything else. That was really cool. And thank you so much for sharing your time with us and for sharing this novel with us. And Vanessa, thank you for your time and for your questions. I really do love the trademark Vanessa Hua speed round. It's my favorite, and I look forward to it every time we have you. If you'll indulge me, I'm going to share a link to our Apple a Month subscription service, because Allegra's book was our March pick this month. So if you like reading books, you might like our subscription service. But without much more, I just wanted to say how grateful I am to be sharing space tonight with both of you and with all of you out there on the internet. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate this.
Yeah, thanks. Good night, folks.